Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to get back to this screen in a moment, but I also just wanted to tell you a little bit about today's lecture. So we are going to be talking about the optics of the eye, and it is going to be lecture number 9 on our regular schedule. But I just realized after doing the recording, as I was standing outside of Robarts, not really, but as I was standing outside of Robarts, that I had the dough moment where I had asked this question in the previous lecture, number 8, and I didn't actually answer that for you. And I don't know how that happened where the slide actually just got skipped right over. So my apologies. And I'm hoping that you get this in time. And so I want to go back and answer that first before getting into today's lecture on the optics of the eye. So how many senses do we have? We have 9, right? And so we have these special senses that we are going to talk about a little bit today. Vision, not so much vision, but more about the optics of how we actually see. Hearing we'll talk about later, equilibrium a little bit later as well. Taste and smell, that lecture is going to be an awesome one because we're all going to bring food to our lecture and we're going to all eat. I'm going to be showing off some of the food that we've been making here at home while we've been kind of waiting out this isolation. And then of course the 4 somatic senses, and we take those for granted as well. And then we have things like touch. We have our skin is sensitive to touch, temperature, where our limbs are located in space, also known as proprioception, and then nociception, the feelings of having itchy skin or painful stimuli on our skin. So we have 9 different senses, and we're partially conscious of these 9 senses most of the time, but we are unconscious. We don't really know, or we're not really aware of like what your blood pressure is, like just sitting there. Do you know what your blood pressure is? Is it high? Is it low? Can you feel your heart pounding as you're sitting there? Hopefully not. Hopefully you're nice and calm. Cheers, have a tea and just have some things that are calming for you. How inflated are your lungs? Are you like really conscious of it, just sort of at rest? Probably not. Blood glucose concentration, do you know how your internal organs are doing? Probably not. And that's what we mean by having like unconscious things going on as well. So back to today's lecture. So today we have to talk about my glasses a lot. I don't know if you wear glasses. I don't know if you have parents who are probably around my age, and they're also starting to exhibit a number of these visual issues as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I don't know about you, but I actually really miss walking by Robarts. If you are a U of T student, this is sort of our landmark. All the different food trucks, and again, it's about seeing things, and it's about sort of missing what has been taken away from us. But to get to where we need to be today, we're going to talk about the optics of vision, and it's going to be like really interesting, I hope, for all of us. So let me go back to sharing that screen again for all of you. So let's hope I get the right one as well. And let's go back. And I'll have to go back to this. Apologies on this. And the question of the day from Dr. Tweed. Great question, by the way. Why do you have muscles inside of your eyeballs? Well, hopefully that will be clear. Haha, clear vision. A little bit later on. Okay, so let's get right to it. So this is what we're going to be talking about, the different parts of the eye that help us to see. And again, you might not think of it this way, but each of these are going to be important in step. So we're going to have to talk about the pupil, and then we're going to have to talk about how the pupil allows us to have both focus as well as a depth of field. So your pupil being like really, really small actually gives us sharp vision, but it's actually not great for us either. So we need to talk a little bit about both. And then refraction. So my lenses refract or bend light, but so does your eye itself. So the cornea, the outer part of the eye, helps to bend light, and so does the lens. We'll talk about all of those. And then when we go back to talking a little bit about changing the shape of the lens and how you can see things close up as well as far away. Hard for me right now because my accommodation is not really that great. So even with my glasses, I often have to take them off, and you probably have seen your parents do the same thing, and it's because of this problem with accommodation. And then we'll talk about correcting these refractive errors a little bit later on as well. All right, ready to go? Let's jump right into it. Okay, so we have the major structures in the eye. And again, we're leading toward understanding what the pupil is and where the lens is sitting behind the pupil. All of these things are going to be really, really important. So the lens is actually this transparent disc. It has to be transparent. And we know that once it gets cloudy and someone develops cataracts, they can't see very well. There's less and less light going in. But normally for young, healthy eyes, which all of you have this transparent disc. And I can actually see my lens is getting a little bit cloudier as time goes on. And this lens is suspended by these ligaments that you can't really see well here, but they're on these ligaments that we call zonules. So these zonules are these ligaments suspending the lens in the different chambers. And it's stuck there because in the front, we have this aqueous chamber or aqueous humor, which is a plasma-like fluid. It's liquidy. And this is in the anterior chamber of your eye. And you can see the aqueous humor here. And behind it, we have this vitreous humor in the vitreous chamber or the vitreous body. And that actually gives your eyeball its shape. Because if you touch your eye, and it always used to freak me out when I went in to see my ophthalmologist, and they kept like touching my eye, and they kept touching their eye, and just totally freaked me out. But of course, you should be able to touch it, and it helps to maintain the shape of the eyeball as well. And it's a clear jelly, and everything in your eye has to be clear. It's important to get light from the front of your eye to the very back here in an unobstructed manner. And that will become even more apparent in the next lecture. So this structure here on the very anterior or front part of your eye is known as the cornea. And this cornea is where light first enters the eye. And it actually is a slightly bulging shape, which you can actually see here in profile. So it's not a perfect sphere. This part bulges out a little bit. And it is continuous with the rest of the eye, the white part of your eye. And this white part of the eye is known as the sclera. So the cornea is basically a continuation of the sclera, and this is the outer wall of the eyeball. And so both the cornea, because it's where light hits first on your eyeball, and then the lens that sits behind it inside your eye, actually help to focus light on the very back part of the eye, which is known as the retina. All of those sensory receptors that we've been talking about in lectures number 6, 7, and 8 are all here at the level of the retina in terms of the visual system. And this is where the photoreceptors are all sitting at the very back of your eye. And that layer itself is called the retina. So light will pass through the cornea, through the lens, and because it's traveling through all this transparent medium, it will be able to hit and be projected onto the retina. And it does so through this opening, which we call the pupil, which is a hole within the iris, which is the colored part of your eye. So I have like a brown iris. You might have like a blue iris. Some of you might have like a hazel iris. And so we all have this iris, and the hole in the middle, that little dark spot, is that pupil. And the pupil is actually incredibly, incredibly important. And we're going to spend some time looking at it. So in bright light, these pupils can constrict or shrink, and you're seeing a little bit of that here. Or maybe you are, there you go. So you're seeing it shrink down to about 1.5 millimeters across. And remember, in light gray, you don't need to worry about these numbers. And this will reduce the amount of light. When you have a lot of light around, you don't really need more light coming in. That will make things like look very, very blurry. In the dark, where there's less light around, you need as much light to get in as possible. And so the pupil will dilate or enlarge. And it gets to be roughly 20 times larger in area if you're just looking at the diameter in terms of the numbers that you see here. So it can increase quite a bit. But the eye actually is incredibly sensitive. In fact, most cameras still to this day, although they can see farther and they can see a lot of detail, in terms of its dynamic range, they would still have a hard time keeping up with the dynamic range of the eye. The eye is able to see in very dark circumstances and very, very light, bright areas as well. So 100 million fold range of illumination. Your cell phone, if you happen to have like an iPhone or one of the newer model Samsungs, they're getting closer, but the dynamic range is still not there. And this pupil is really what allows us to compensate for having too much light or too little light in the dark. And what controls the size of this pupil are these smooth muscles. So why do you have muscles inside your eyeballs? It's these smooth muscles. They're ones that we can't control. Smooth muscles are beyond our physical, conscious level of control, and they're done automatically. And in bright light, and this is a good slide for you to jot down some notes or circle, highlight. You'll see this at the very end when I ask you a practice question. So in bright light, these parasympathetic signals, and parasympathetic is part of the autonomic nervous system, and autonomic nervous system controls smooth muscle, help the brain to contract the ring-shaped pupillary constrictor muscles that will shrink the eyeball down. If you look very carefully in this eye, and you can see it within the iris, these little striations here, those represent the radial pupillary muscles as well. And when sympathetic signals in the dark become activated, they will help to dilate the pupil. And you can actually see these muscles changing in shape as they constrict. All right, so a good slide for you to make sure that you know. Just knowing the details, when do you turn on parasympathetic? That's in the light. What happens to the pupil? Again, they tend to constrict, making it smaller. And again, in the dark, the opposite, but using the sympathetic nervous system. Please spend time on it to jot down those notes, make sure that you're clear on it. It's probably a good idea to make sure that you know it for any of the upcoming assignments, and it will be helpful for you. So the pupil, this little opening that you see here, is actually really useful to help us to focus light. And it's analogous in many ways to what is known as a pinhole camera. And the name is exactly as it sounds. There's just a little pinhole where light can enter into a camera, and then the image falls on the back film, and it allows you to take a picture. And a small pupil is where a pinhole, it's the smallest possible opening, and it ensures that each point of light here is faithfully reproduced at the back of the eye onto the retina. So it's only coming from one direction in space. There's no other way for the light to get in. The opening is so small that light has to travel in this straight line, and it can't let in too much light. And this is why we get this faithful reproduction. And this is what focus means. And this would be in perfect focus, right? So this point of light focuses perfectly here. This point of light focuses perfectly there, etc. And in bright light situations, we want a really small pinhole. So interestingly, and just for your own information, sea creatures like the nautilus, which is shown to you here, actually have a spherical lensless pinhole-like eyeball. And it's fairly large. It's 1 centimeter across, and you can actually make out its eye here. And as a result, they can focus entirely without pupils. Now, remember, and I'm going to come back to this later, they're living in an aqueous or water environment. So that will also account for why they can get away with doing some of this. So the pupil also helps with what is known as the depth of field. And again, another concept for you to make sure that you know. So this is in focus. The other gnome at the back is not in focus. And the gnome here in the front is also not in focus. You're able to focus on this depth or on this field only, and this gives you the depth of field. I could focus on the front, in the middle, or on the back. And so when the pupil is very, very small and it's tightly constricted, when we have a lot of light, we actually have what is known as a full depth of field. Everything is equally in focus. So go outside if you have the opportunity, and you should do that anyways. It's the summer, so why not? Go outside, take a look outside on a really clear day, and everything is in perfect focus because it's a bright sunny day. All that light is coming in through a very small pupil. But when the pupil is dilated, it gets larger, and that sympathetic nervous system is coming in, we have a shallow depth of field. So only objects that are near one specific distance tends to be in focus. And that distance depends on what your lens is trying to see. So think about like normal light conditions, like where you might be in sort of a room at dusk. And if you're trying to read a book, you might have to get it to the proper focus length. So here, again, if we're only using a pinhole camera system, and analogous to that, we've looked at this scenario here. The retinal image, even though we're getting very precise, very focused images, the image on the retina tends to be dim. There's not a lot of light getting in. And you probably, if you're into photography at all, you know that there's a balance between like opening up the camera so that more light is coming in versus like trying to get the proper depth of focus. And your eye has that same issue. So enlarging this retina, enlarging the pupil will let in more light, as you can see here, but now that single point image is blurred and spread out over a much wider part of the retina, right? And so enlarging this makes the image brighter because more light is coming through and you can see that, but it also means that it's not in a single focused plane anymore, and the image gets spread out over a larger area. So the question is, that's not neither of those is great, right? So having something where you get really focused, but it's so dim that you might not be able to accurately determine what it is, letting in more light, but the image itself gets fuzzier, less focused. How do we come up with a happy medium? How do we make sure that we can get a lot of light coming in, but we also get a focused image where everything looks clear? It's not blurry for you. Okay, so how does this happen? And it happens by refraction. Some of that refraction occurs normally. And again, apologies on that. Refraction occurs normally because of how light is moving through air. And let's take a look. In air, if a point source image is shooting off beams of light here, we have this structure, the cornea, that we looked at earlier. And the cornea has a slightly different refractive index, which means refraction means bending of light. And our corneas, again, are clear. They're made out of long fibers, extracellular matrix molecules known as collagen. And these clear protein molecules known as collagen tend to bend light very, very strongly. So they have a strong refractive index because there's a big difference between light that is traveling through air and light that is shining through the cornea, which has a bigger refractive index. So that light will then bend, and this is known as refraction. In water, if you were using the cornea down at the bottom, it would actually refract less because the refractive index of the cornea and the proteins in cornea are about the same as they are in water. So there's little bending of light because the difference between the medium is about the same. So again, if we were to take a look, where does all of this refraction occur? And it turns out there's actually a lot that occurs here at the level of the cornea. Some of you will have heard of different types of surgery to reshape the cornea a little bit. And that's because the cornea, reshaping it, is responsible for about 2/3 of the total refraction, the bending of light that occurs. The lens, even though that's going to be the focus of what we talk about here today, and we can control that focus, actually is responsible for just 1/3 of all of the bending of the light that actually occurs. The cornea does a fair bit of this, about 2/3 of the eye's refraction. But we're going to focus on the lens because that's something that you can change on a day-to-day basis. So you move things closer to your eye and focus on it, move things away. You can change your lens. You can't really change your cornea unless you're going in for surgery. And that's an expensive surgery, by the way. It's not cheap. Here's this other question for you as well. Have you ever heard of astigmatism? And do you know what astigmatism is? Is it a problem with the cornea or is it a problem with the lens? And I'll just leave that as a thought question for you. And then you can think a little bit about that. And if you want to email me or post this on the discussions page, that's up to you. And what do you think astigmatism will do, depending on what you find out about it or what you know about it, in terms of the image that gets processed on the retina? Okay, so a little bit of homework for you, I guess, at this stage. So looking at the level of the lens, if we look at the lens, we have these cells that make up the lens that are anucleated. There are no nuclei. The cells in the lens normally are packed with a clear protein known as crystalline, and they are found in the zipper-like pattern so that there's a lot of flexibility, but there's also a lot of structure associated with it. It doesn't have a blood supply, obviously, but it will absorb nutrients directly from that aqueous humor. Remember on the very front part of the eye. Now, this is all really important because as you get older, and especially as these crystallines get exposed to UV light, they will change their structure. And as they change their structure, it will actually grow cloudy. And many of you will know that older individuals get sort of this cloudy lens that has to be surgically removed because they're not able to see as well through this cloudy lens. So the lens of the eye normally tends to be convex, this shape that you see here. And again, this is the lens behind the pupil. We're getting these light rays. We are seeing refraction through this lens where we see bending of light, and we can see that it is convex, so it is going to focus it on a very narrow point. Okay, so this convex lens means that it's just fatter in the middle, thinner on the edges, which is what you are seeing here. And this convex lens helps to focus light on a point. So it's like a magnifying glass, in other words. Concave lenses are thinner in the middle, thicker at the edges. We use them to correct vision, but the lens of the eye normally is not this concave shape, all right? So how can we change the refractive index of this lens? So we see light kind of coming in, and it's going to hit at these different angles that you see here. So this right angle, or it might be this different angle here at the bottom and at the top. And the angle at which this light hits is obviously going to change a lot depending on the shape of the lens. The rounder it is, the angles are going to change. The flatter it is, these angles are also going to change. And this means that by changing the shape of the lens, we can actually change this angle of incidence and the way in which light is hitting it. And this will also change how we can focus this light as well. And this gets to this issue of how do we actually change the shape of the lens? And this is what we call accommodation. And why do your parents, as they get older, why will they have problems with accommodation? So a rounder lens will bend light more, and it makes sense. So let's say we have this object in the same field of view, and the lens in the eyes, two different eyes, are actually at the same distance away from that visual object. And we can see that we have this convex lens, and this convex lens is much rounder. And as a result, the focal point where it is actually focusing light tends to change shape as well, or tends to change its focal length. Hopefully that's clear for you. And again, you probably have heard this in your physics classes back in grade 12, or maybe in first year physics as well. So for clear vision, this is what we need to be able to do. For you to be able to see clearly and perfectly and have a bright, sharp image without any type of corrective lens in front of it, a point of light has to travel through, and it gets refracted a lot, but we won't talk about it. It's refracted at the level of the cornea, which is what you see here. It gets all the way through because this is clear. It then passes through this convex lens, and depending on the shape of this convex lens, it will make a perfectly focused image on the retina, which we know has these photoreceptors. Are you with me so far? I'm hoping that you are, and then if you are, let's just continue on and see what happens. So if an object draws a little bit closer to this lens, and the lens stays relatively flat, you know that it's no longer going to be in focus. So you can actually do this, and you are focusing on your hand, and you keep it on the same level, and then it moves closer. You know that it's going to start looking blurry, and that's because the focus of the light that's coming through on that lens that you're keeping the same shape is actually falling behind the retina. It's not that nice sharp image that you had before. And so this gets into accommodation. So as we bring things closer to make them more in focus, so as I try to read the writing that's on this sheet and I try to bring it into more focus, I need to make my lens more and more round. And this gets back to why we have these muscles in the eye. And these are some of the ciliary muscles. So it's not just the iris, etc. It's also these ciliary muscles. We have a number of muscle systems that are important to us. And we can see that the autonomic nervous system is also helping us here. It not just controls the pupil, but it also controls the lens shape as well. So the parasympathetic nervous system will contract the ring-shaped smooth ciliary muscle. Now, these are not the same as changing the size of the pupil. So if you go back to that original slide, it may look like it's the same, but it is not. Make sure that you are clear between this and what we talked about with the pupil. They are not the same system. They are working together, but they're working on different types of muscles in your eye. Okay, so just to be clear, and you will need to know it. So please make sure that you're reviewing this. So parasympathetic nervous system signals contract the ring-shaped smooth ciliary muscle. Again, it's still smooth muscle. We don't have conscious control of it. It reduces the tension on those zonules, those ligaments that I talked about earlier. And as it reduces the tension, it kind of makes the lens go rounder. All right? And let's see if I can actually model that a little bit for you. So just give me a quick second. So just doing this sort of off the cuff. So sorry, it's going to sound a little noisy. So here's the tension on the, let's pretend this is the lens, if you can see it. And if this is sort of the normal tension on it, I'm going to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and then it's going to contract the smooth muscles that are holding these zonules in the current position. And as a result of this activation, this is what's going to happen to the lens. It's going to actually grow rounder. Can't see that really well, can you? Okay, so it will actually grow into this rounder shape. So sympathetic nervous system activation will relax the ciliary muscles. It will pull on the zonules, and as it pulls on the zonules, it actually makes the lens flatter. And again, it sort of works because it's in suspension, it's pulling on these ligaments, all right? You need a little bit of time to kind of process that. I'm actually going to try to find a really good YouTube video, and maybe I will try to post that for you on a YouTube video so that it makes a little bit more sense. It's a lot easier to see in an animation, to be quite honest. And this rounding of the lens for near vision is something that we call accommodation. This whole process that we've just been describing. And in addition to that, not just the rounding of the lens, the closest point that you can focus on is called the near point of accommodation. So at some point, you actually can't get your lens round enough so that it's not going to be in perfect focus. And as you get older, your parents, myself, and even you, one day, you too will also grow older. This lens is no longer going to be able to change its shape from being flat to being round to being flat. And as a result, your accommodation, your ability to see things close is going to disappear. And this is known as presbyopia. And this is because the proteins, the crystalline in the lens also tends to stiffen, and they're no longer as malleable. So not only do they get cloudier, but they also tend to stiffen with age as well. So accommodation is actually an unconscious or autonomic reflex, and you can actually see it in action. So you can hold up your hand and close one eye, hold up your hand, spread your fingers apart, and then focus between your fingers on a distant object. And you'll notice that that object gets in focus, but your fingers are no longer in focus. And then when you go back and try to focus on your fingers, then the distant object is no longer going to be in focus. And that's because your lens has accommodated or gotten rounder as you try to focus on something closer to you. Hopefully you're clear on that, and I'm hoping that everything has been okay so far. So let's talk about some refractive errors that might happen. So I don't know how many of you are actually farsighted, so you can see things at a distance, but you can't really, or you can see in a slightly different way. Now let me get to that in a moment. So here's this point of light. It is traveling through this lens, and the light is actually falling behind the retina. And this is what is known as hyperopia or farsightedness. And the problem gets solved if you put a lens, a corrective lens, in front of the eye, and it will focus that light back to the lens. And the lens of the eye isn't bending the light rays enough, and so this extra convex lens tends to help out. Myopia, which is what I have, and I'm assuming that many of you have, is where you have nearsightedness. So you can see things that are close up, but you can't see things that are far away. And that's nearsightedness, which is what I have. I don't have hyperopia, which is a little bit different. So I can see things close without wearing glasses, but things that are far away, like they get really, really blurry for me. And this is because the focal point of images from far away are actually not able to focus. They fall just short of the front of the retina. And again, the problem gets solved by putting in a convex lens. So my lenses are concave in front of the eye. And again, apologies on that, to spread out the light a bit more and to bring things back into focus. And this is because the lens of the eye is also bending light rays too much, and so this concave lens actually counteracts that by refocusing and spreading out the rays a little bit more so that they can fall into focus. Some individuals also have a different shaped eye, so some are flatter, some are round, some are longer, and so that might also account for that a little bit as well. So here's this last practice question for you from this section. I hope that you'll spend a little bit of time on it. Again, it's a long grind in this lecture series, so please make sure you're taking good care of yourself. Spend the time whenever you can, and again, get out if you at all possibly can. This is already like lecture number 9. That's a lot of lectures that you're kind of going through. There are a lot of assignments, there are a lot of concepts, and I want you to learn as much as you possibly can about these different systems. I think they're all really exciting. I hope that you are also thinking that they're exciting as well. And hopefully I'll see you in the next lecture block that we have coming up as well. So take care of yourselves wherever you're at today, whether you're in Canada, in Toronto, or if you're overseas. Take care of yourself, get out when you can. Go out and take a look at whatever you can using that visual system that we just talked about today. All right, everyone, I think for today, I'm going to wrap things up here. Take care of your synapses. I'll see you in the next lecture.